Welcome to Nicki Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight's story is a soft reimagining of Snow White and Rose Red, a winter fairy tale about kindness, quiet courage, and the unexpected ways warmth sometimes finds us. There's nothing you need to follow too closely, so settle in and let the world grow gentle around you. At the edge of a great forest, where the trees grew thick and old and the paths turned soft beneath fallen leaves, there stood a little cottage with a thatched roof and small bright windows. It wasn't a grand house. No carriage road led to its door. No stone wall guarded it from the wind. It stood simply and quietly where the meadow ended and the woods began, with a narrow garden before it, a well beside it, and 2 rose trees growing near the threshold. One rose tree bloomed white in its season. The other bloomed red. By late autumn, the blossoms were gone. Only the dark stems remained, bending gently in the cold, while a few stubborn leaves still clung to their branches, reluctant to surrender to winter. Beyond the cottage, the forest was changing. The high branches had thinned enough to reveal the pale evening sky between them. Birds moved softly from limb to limb, seeking shelter before nightfall. The air carried the scent of damp earth, fallen leaves, and the faint sharpness that comes just before snow. And from the cottage chimney, a ribbon of smoke drifted quietly into the still air. Inside, it was warm. A small fire glowed upon the hearth, not large, but carefully tended. Firelight moved softly across the wooden floor, climbed the worn edges of the table, and flickered against shelves where bowls and cups rested neatly side by side. Above the coals, a kettle murmured gently to itself. Near the fire sat the mother of the house. She was a quiet woman, with kind eyes and hands that had known both work and tenderness. In the evenings, she often settled near the hearth with mending in her lap, stitching by candlelight while the wind moved softly around the cottage walls. She had very little in the way of riches. No silver cupboard stood in her kitchen. No fine carriage ever came to her door. And yet, in many ways, she possessed a kind of wealth that even the richest houses sometimes fail to hold. A warm hearth after a cold day, a table where everyone was welcome, hands eager to help, and the quiet comfort of being deeply loved. The blankets were folded, the bread was wrapped in a clean cloth, and the herbs gathered in summer hung drying from the beams. And though the cottage was small, it carried the feeling of a place where love had been practiced so faithfully that it had become part of the walls themselves. Her 2 daughters were there with her. They were called Snow White and Rose Red, after the rose trees growing beside the cottage door. Snow White sat near the window, where the last pale light of the evening still lingered against the glass. She was winding a length of wool carefully into a neat ball, her hands moving slowly so the thread wouldn't tangle. There was a stillness about her, a thoughtful quiet that made ordinary things feel peaceful in her care. Rose Red sat near the hearth, sorting kindling into a basket. Every so often, she looked toward the fire, or toward the window, or over at her sister, as if the world was always offering her one more thing to notice. She wasn't restless, only bright-hearted. Where Snow White noticed the hush before snowfall, Rose Red noticed fox tracks beside the garden gate. Where Snow White loved the quiet of twilight, Rose Red delighted in the first evening star. Yet they belonged easily to one another. They had never learned to envy the gifts others carried. Snow White's calm made room for Rose Red's warmth. Rose Red's warmth drew laughter from Snow White's quiet. And their mother, watching them by the fire, often thought that each daughter carried one half of the same gentle light. In daytime, the sisters helped with whatever needed doing. They swept the cottage floor, gathered kindling from the edge of the woods, fetched water from the well. In warmer months, they filled their aprons with berries and gathered herbs for drying. Sometimes they carried bread to an elderly widow farther down the lane, especially when storms had made the roads difficult. The forest was not a strange place to them. They knew where violets first appeared in spring, which stones stayed dry after rain, and the hollow tree where the squirrels tucked away acorns, and the fern-covered place where the deer sometimes stood quietly at dusk. The wild creatures of the woods didn't fear them as they feared the others. Birds sometimes fluttered near Snow White as she scattered crumbs. Once a small hare had rested beneath the garden bench while Rose Red whispered to it as if speaking to an old friend. And more than once, when the sisters walked home carrying bundles of gathered wood, a young deer had lifted its head from the trees and watched them pass without running away. Their mother never encouraged foolishness. She taught them to be careful with rivers after rain, careful with unfamiliar paths, careful of storms that arrived faster than expected, and careful of believing one knew the forest better than the forest knew itself. But she also taught them that fear was not the same thing as wisdom. Kindness, she sometimes told them while fastening Rose Red's shawl or brushing a leaf from Snow White's sleeve, must keep its eyes open, but open eyes need not make a closed heart. The sisters remembered this. They remembered it when they found a bird with an injured wing and carried it home wrapped gently in wool. They remembered it when a hungry stray dog wandered near the garden and their mother shared scraps from the supper pot. And they remembered it now, as winter pressed nearer and the nights grew longer, when the world beyond the cottage seemed full of small, unseen creatures searching for warmth. That evening, the first snow began to fall. At first, only a few flakes drifted quietly past the window. Then more followed, soft, slow, steady. Before long, the garden path had turned pale, and the two bare rose trees stood dark against the growing white. Rose Red rose first and crossed to the window. "There it is," she said softly. Snow White joined her. Together, they stood watching the snow settle over the little world that they loved. The well, the narrow garden, the winding path disappearing towards the woods. Behind them, their mother stirred the evening soup and placed 3 bowls upon the table. The cottage filled with the scent of broth and herbs, with firelight and quiet, with the soft, settling sounds of a familiar home at day's end. Outside, winter was arriving. Inside, all was warm, and none of them knew yet that before the season had passed, something from the deep heart of the forest would come knocking at their door. Winter settled fully over the little cottage at the edge of the forest. The days grew shorter now, and evening arrived earlier than anyone expected it to. Snow White gathered quietly along the narrow path, softened the meadow beyond the garden, and settled like white velvet upon the roof of the cottage until the world outside seemed wrapped in silence. Inside, however, life moved in its familiar and comforting ways. The mornings began with firewood carried carefully inside before cold grew sharpest. Porridge steamed upon the table while pale daylight slowly pressed across the windows, and the sisters wrapped themselves in woolen shawls before beginning the small duties of the day. Snow White swept the floor or helped her mother with the sewing near the fire. Rose Red gathered kindling when the weather allowed, and often returned with cheeks pink from the cold and the stories from the fox tracks near the garden gate, or birds she had spotted sheltering among the fir trees. And as evening came, the little house always seemed to soften. The kettle murmured quietly above the hearth. Candles glowed low against the gathering dark. Soup simmered gently, filling the rooms with warmth and the scent of herbs. The cold remained outside where it belonged. And one evening, not after the long season's first heavy snowfall, the weather changed. All afternoon the wind had wandered restlessly through the trees, stirring loose snow from the branches and sending pale clouds drifting across the woods. By nightfall, however, the storm had grown stronger. The trees bent and sighed beneath its passing, and the sound of the wind moved through the forest with a strange voice, sometimes low and distant, sometimes rising suddenly as though the woods themselves had begun whispering to one another. Inside, the sisters sat close to the fire. Rose Red had a basket of chestnuts beside her, and turned them now and then, so they roasted evenly near the hearth. Snow White sat nearby, carefully mending the worn cuff of one of her mother's sleeves, while the candlelight rested softly across her hands. Their mother sat in her usual chair, with sewing in her lap. For a time, no one spoke very much. They had never minded quiet in that house. The fire had its own familiar sounds, the kettle another, and beyond the walls, the wind seemed more than willing to fill whatever silence remained. At last, Rose Red glanced toward the darkened window. "I wonder where the creatures go in weather like this," she said softly. "The poor things must be freezing." Snow White looked up from her stitching. "The deer likely shelter beneath the fir trees," she said, "and foxes are clever enough to find hidden places." "Yes," Rose Red said, though she still looked toward the storm. "But I always wonder, where are the smaller ones?" Their mother smiled gently. "Winter teaches every creature how to seek warmth," she said, "even the wildest among them." Almost at once, a strong gust of wind swept against the cottage. The shutters rattled. Something brushed heavily against the wall outside. Rose Red startled and gave a small laugh. "Oh, for a moment," she said, pressing her hand to her chest, "I thought something had knocked." Before anyone answered, there came a sound. Not loud, only a faint scraping against the door. Snow White lowered her sewing. The room grew still. The sound came again, slow, but heavy somehow, as though something large had shifted against the wood. "Perhaps a branch," Snow White said quietly. Rose Red tilted her head. "In weather like this?" For a moment, there was nothing. Only wind, only firelight, only the soft hiss of snow brushing the wind. Then, a knock, firm this time, clear enough that none of them could mistake it. Rose Red looked quickly toward her mother. Snow White rose from her chair. Outside, the storm pressed close around the house, wrapping the cottage in cold and darkness. Another knock followed, quieter this time, though no less certain. Their mother calmly folded her sewing in her lap. "Well," she said, as though nothing in the world were unusual, "whatever soul stands outside in the weather like this ought not be left waiting." Rose Red hesitated. Snow White stepped closer beside her sister. Together, they crossed to the door. Slowly, Rose Red lifted the latch. At once, cold air rushed inside. Snow swept briefly across the floor. The candle flames trembled, and standing just beyond the threshold was a bear. Rose Red gave a startled cry and stepped back at once. Snow White caught hold of her arm. The creature was enormous. Snow clung thickly to his dark fur, and ice glimmered faintly along the long hairs around his neck and shoulders. He seemed far larger standing there than any creature had a right to be, his broad shape nearly filling the doorway while the storm moved endlessly behind him. Yet, what startled the sisters most was not his size, nor even the wildness of him. It was the expression in his eyes. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood there, quiet and still, as though exhaustion had followed him all the way from the deepest part of the forest. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then their mother rose. To the sisters' astonishment, she showed no fear at all. Instead, she looked carefully at the creature standing in the snow and said, in the same voice she might have used for an unexpected traveler, "Well now, you look half frozen." Rose Red turned quickly. "Mother!" But the mother only laid a calm hand upon her arm. "No creature should be turned away in weather such as this," she said softly. "Not if it comes peacefully." The bear remained standing where he was. Snow melted slowly from his fur onto the threshold. The wind moved around him. Still, he did not step forward. It seemed, somehow, as though he had not expected kindness. "You may come nearer to the fire," their mother said gently, stepping aside. "If you mean no harm, you are welcome to warm yourself." For another moment, the great creature remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, carefully, he stepped inside. Snow White quietly shut the door behind him, and all at once the storm seemed farther away. The bear paused uncertainly near the hearth. Their mother pulled a thick rug a little closer to the warmth. "There now," she said. "You may rest here." To the sisters' amazement, the bear lowered himself beside the fire with a weariness, with a heaviness of someone who had traveled very far in bitter weather. Steam rose faintly from his damp coat as warmth slowly returned to him. For a while, no one said very much. Rose Red stayed close beside Snow White. Snow White remained quietly watchful. And together, they studied the strange visitor resting in their home. The firelight moved softly across his dark fur, and outside, snow drifted endlessly through the woods. At length, Rose Red leaned closer and whispered, "He doesn't seem frightening now." Snow White watched the great creature resting quietly beside the fire. "No," she said softly after a moment. "He seems—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. Then quietly, "lonely." And somehow, though neither sister could quite explain why, the cottage no longer felt strange with him there, only fuller, as though winter itself, wandering cold and weary through the forest, had quietly come to rest beside their fire. The next morning, when Snow White opened her eyes, she lay still for a quiet moment, listening. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the world wrapped in that deep winter hush that sometimes follows heavy snowfall. Pale morning light rested softly against the windows. Somewhere, outside, snow slipped from a branch and fell with a muffled sound into the garden below. The fire upon the hearth had burned low in the night, though faint warmth still lingered in the room. And then she remembered the strange knocking, the dark shape standing in the storm, the enormous bear lying beside their fire as though winter itself had wandered in, cold and weary, seeking shelter. Snow White pushed herself quietly upright. Across the room, Rose Red was already awake. Her hair had slipped loose during the night, and her bright eyes were fixed toward the hearth with a sort of delighted amazement she rarely bothered to hide. "He's still here," she whispered. Snow White followed her gaze. The bear lay sleeping upon their rug that their mother had drawn near the fire the evening before. He had curled himself as neatly as such a great creature could, though even resting, he seemed far too large for the little cottage. One broad paw rested near the ashes, and his breathing came deep and slow, rising and falling with such steadiness that somehow the room itself felt calmer for it. In daylight, he looked different, still enormous, still unmistakably wild. Yet now the storm no longer stood beside him. There seemed to be less fierceness in him than weariness. Their mother was already awake, kneeling beside the hearth and coaxing life back into the coals. when she noticed the sisters watching. She smiled softly. "Quietly now," she said. "He has likely slept little these past nights." Rose Red slipped from the bed almost at once, curiosity already pulling her forward. Snow White followed more slowly. The bear didn't stir. Only one ear twitched faintly when the kettle began to murmur above the fire. Rose Red pressed her lips together to hide a smile. "He hears everything," she whispered. Snow White felt herself smile too. Her fear from the night before had not vanished entirely, but it had softened around the edges into something gentler. Wonder, perhaps, or pity, or simply the strange feeling that comes when something unfamiliar begins, little by little, to feel less frightening than expected. When the bear finally woke, he lifted his great head slowly and blinked as though surprised to find himself still beside Warmth. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Their mother rose calmly from her chair. "Good morning," she said, as naturally as though speaking to any ordinary guest. The bear looked at her, and then, to the astonishment of both sisters, he answered. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and quiet, carrying the rough warmth of the distant thunder softened by snow. Rose Red's mouth fell open. Snow White blinked, but their mother only nodded, as though speaking bears were surprising, certainly, but no reason to forget one's manners. "Well," she said, "then you may as well stay for breakfast." The bear lowered his head slightly, whether in gratitude or simple tiredness, neither sister could tell. After that moment, the bear began returning often. At first, he came only when the storm swept hard through the forest, appearing at the cottage door after sunset with snow gathered thickly upon his shoulders and frost caught in the fur around his neck. He never entered uninvited. Instead, he waited patiently outside until someone opened the door, as though even a creature as large as he understood that warmth was something offered, not taken. Their mother approved of this very much. "A polite guest," she once said quietly, while brushing snow from the doorway after he entered. "That is rarer than one might expect." Rose Red laughed softly at this and looked toward the bear. "You hear that?" she asked him. "You are being complimented." The bear made a low sound deep in his chest that might have been amusement. At least, Rose Red insisted it was. Before long, the sisters grew accustomed to helping him shed the forest before he came fully into warmth. When he arrived, the snow piled along his back, and dark ice clinging to the fur at his shoulders. Rose Red would stand upon the hearth rug and pat the snow gently from his coat with both hands. "You cannot bring the whole winter inside," she would tell him. The bear stood patiently beneath her care, great and still as the dark tree in a forest. Now and then, he gave her a slow shake that sent loose snow tumbling onto the floorboards, in spite of all her efforts. Snow White would fetch an old cloth to wipe the wet places near the door, and before long, she too found herself smoothing the thick fur beneath his shoulders, where the cold lingered longest. The bear never seemed to mind. If anything, he stood more quietly beneath their hands, as though such simple kindness was rarer than warmth itself. Rose Red, as everyone would have expected, grew comfortable with him first. She had always trusted warmth when she found it. She spoke to the bear easily, asking endless questions about the woods beyond the places she and Snow White knew best. Was the snow deeper farther north? Did foxes truly sleep beneath tree roots during storms? Did the owls mind the cold? Sometimes the bear answered. Sometimes he only listened. And sometimes, when Rose Red asked far too many questions without pause, he lowered his head into his paws and closed his eyes as though gently excusing himself from the conversation. Rose Red would laugh then. "Oh, very well," she would say. "I see you've grown tired of me." Snow White came to know him differently. She spoke less. Instead, she noticed things. She noticed how carefully he moved through the cottage so as not to disturb anything, despite his size. She noticed that he always paused near the door to shake snow from his fur before stepping fully inside, as though reluctant to bring too much winter in with him. And she noticed that whenever their mother told stories in the evening, the bear listened with an attentiveness that felt strangely human. Sometimes, after Rose Red had drifted to sleep beside the fire and their mother folded away her sewing for the night, Snow White remained awake a little longer. She would sit near the hearth while the flames settled lower and speak softly into the quiet. Not about anything grand, only small things. How still the woods had seemed that morning, where the first violets would bloom when the spring eventually returned. How the rose trees beside the cottage looked beautiful even now, bare beneath the snow. The bear rarely answered, yet somehow Snow White never minded. He listened in a way that made silence feel companionable rather than empty. And over time, she began to feel that perhaps he understood far more than he ever chose to say. As winter deepened, the bear slowly became part of the rhythm of the house. The sisters found themselves listening for his knock during storms. Rose Red often glanced toward the window when the snow grew heavy. Snow White gently wondered whether he had found shelter on nights he didn't come. And whenever he arrived, the cottage seemed somehow fuller, as though another steady heart had joined the evening. There were nights when the wind moved fiercely through the trees and snow pressed thickly against the windows until the world outside disappeared altogether. On those evenings, the sisters sat close behind the hearth where their mother mended clothes and stirred soup, and the bear stretched comfortably near the warmth. The firelight moved softly across his dark coat. The kettle murmured. The wind wandered harmlessly outside, and together they passed the long winter evenings in quiet contentment. Once, after a snowfall so deep that the garden gate could scarcely be opened, Rose Red wrapped herself in her cloak and declared that she would clear the path before supper. Snow White doubted she would get very far. The mother doubted it too. Still, Rose Red marched outside carrying a broom nearly as tall as herself. She had gone only a few determined steps when the snow gathered halfway to her knees. The bear, who had arrived before dawn and still lingered near the doorway, watched for a long moment. Then, without warning, he lumbered past her into the garden. With several broad sweeps of his great paws, he cleared more snow than Rose Red had managed in all her efforts. Rose Red stood perfectly still, gripping her broom. "Well," she said at last, trying very hard to sound dignified, "that hardly seems fair." The bear glanced toward her, then gave one deep, rumbling huff. Snow White laughed, a clear, quiet laugh that surprised even herself. For a brief moment, the bear's expression shifted in a way that she could not explain. Not smiling, for a bear could barely smile, and yet he seemed pleased. So winter passed. Not quickly, for winter never passes quickly when one is living gently inside of it. It passed through candlelit evenings and steaming bowls of soup, through snow gathered upon windowsills and mittens drying beside the fire, through quiet stories told near the hearth while the storms wandered endlessly through the woods. And somewhere, among all those evenings, without anyone speaking of it aloud, the bear stopped feeling like a visitor. He had become, in some strange and quiet way, part of the household itself. Not family exactly. Something gentler, something harder to name. A companion to winter, a steady presence beside the fire. And when storms gathered over the forest, the sisters no longer wondered whether he would come. Instead, they found himself quietly hoping that he would. Winter never leaves all at once. Even after the worst of the cold had passed, the forest still held tightly to its silences. Snow lingered in the shaded places near the trees, and pale frost sometimes silvered in the garden in the early morning, only to disappear again beneath the gentle warmth of the afternoon sunlight. Yet, Little by little, the world began to change. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the cottage roof. The path near the well softened beneath their feet, and the brook, silent so long beneath the covering of ice, began once to speak in quiet voices through the woods. And though the rose trees beside the cottage stood bare, Rose Red was certain she had seen the smallest swelling of buds along their branches. "Not yet," Snow White told her one morning, smiling as they stood near the garden gate. "Soon," Rose Red insisted. Inside the cottage, life moved gently onward. Yet something, though neither sister spoke of it at first, had begun to feel different. The bear still came. He settled near the hearth after snowy evenings, still listened while the mother mended clothes and told stories beside the fire, still accepted Rose Red's cheerful scolding whenever she brushed snow from his coat. "You cannot bring all of winter inside," she told him one evening, patting loose snow from the thick fur along his shoulders. The bear stood patiently beneath her hands. Snow White smiled from nearby as she spread an old cloth near the door to catch the melting dampness. But even so, something had changed. The bear had grown quieter. Sometimes he stood for long stretches at the window, gazing toward the forest as if listening for something only he could hear. Sometimes his eyes lingered upon the trees beyond the garden, long after the evening stories had ended. And more than once, Snow White woke in the night to find the place beside the hearth empty, only to discover deep tracks in the snow the next morning, leading back towards the woods. "He seems restless," Rose Red whispered one evening after the bear had gone strangely silent beside the fire. Snow White nodded. Their mother folded her sewing carefully into her lap. "Spring stirs many things awake," she said quietly, "even hearts that have rested through winter." The sisters said nothing to this, yet both felt a small uneasiness they could not quite explain. For the first time since the bear had come into their lives, they found themselves wondering, not whether he would arrive, but whether one evening he might not. The answer came sooner than either wished. One evening, when the sky still held the pale gold of early spring sunset, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth, the bear arrived, later than usual. The sisters knew at once that something was different. He didn't settle comfortably near the hearth. He didn't stretch himself upon the rug. Instead, he stood quietly near the fire, though his attention seemed fixed elsewhere. Rose Red looked up from her sewing. "You're strange tonight," she said softly. The bear turned his great head toward her. Snow White, sitting nearby, felt something tighten quietly in her chest. At length, the bear spoke. "The winter has sheltered me here," he said. His deep voice seemed gentler than usual somehow. "And your kindness has given me more peace than I expected to find." Neither sister spoke. The room had grown strangely still. Even the kettle seemed quieter. "But spring has come," the bear continued, "and I must soon return to the forest." Rose Red lowered her sewing at once. "Return?" she said quickly. The word escaped before she could soften it. The bear lowered his head gently. "There are things hidden beneath the earth, treasures buried deep, safe beneath winter frost. But when the ground softens, there are greedy hearts that would steal what does not belong to them." Snow White listened quietly. There had always been something hidden inside of him, something sorrowful, something waiting. "And you must guard them?" the mother said gently. "Yes," the bear answered. No one spoke for a while. The fire shifted softly. Outside, water slipped somewhere from the roof and fell into the garden below. Rose Red looked down at her hands. "When will you return?" she asked at last. The bear was quiet for so long that Snow White feared he might not answer. "I don't know," he said softly. Something inside Rose Red's face changed then, though she tried very hard not to show it. Snow White looked toward the hearth, toward the place where he had slept through the storm after storm, and suddenly the room felt smaller than it had before. Their mother reached quietly for her sewing once more. "It is the way of the seasons," she said gently. "Winter keeps us close. Spring asks us to trust what must wander." Snow White thought this sounded wise, yet wisdom did not make leaving easier. That evening passed more quietly than usual. Rose Red spoke less. Snow White found herself watching the bear whenever she thought he wasn't looking. And though no one said it out loud, the warmth of the cottage suddenly felt fragile somehow, as though they all understood something precious had already begun slipping gently toward goodbye. The next morning dawned bright and soft. Mist rested low over the meadow. The snow had nearly vanished from the garden path, leaving dark earth beneath. The 2 rose trees beside the door stood bare still, though tiny green signs of life had begun quietly returning to their branches. The bear waited near the threshold. Rose Red stood beside him first. She laid both hands against the thick fur near his shoulder. "You are never a burden," she said quietly. The bear lowered his head toward her. Snow White stepped closer. She imagined this moment before and found herself strangely unprepared for it. "You made winter feel less lonely," she said softly. The bear looked at her with such quiet sadness in his eyes that for one brief moment Snow White thought he might say something more. Instead, he bowed his head slightly. Their mother stood in the doorway behind them. "You will always find warmth here," she said. The bear remained still for a moment, as though carrying those words carefully somewhere inside himself. Then slowly, he turned toward the woods. The sisters walked with him as far as the edge of the garden. The forest beyond looked different now than it had in winter. Dark earth showed through the melting snow. Birds moved through the branches again. Somewhere nearby, unseen water hurried over stone. At the edge of the trees, the bear paused. Rose Red lifted a hand. Snow White stood very still. And for a long moment, he looked back at them. Then, without a sound, he disappeared into the forest. The sisters stood watching long after he was gone. "It feels quieter," Rose Red said at last. Snow White nodded. "Yes, it does." Still, spring had arrived, and the world was waking whether hearts felt ready or not. So in the days that followed, the sisters returned once more to their walks through the woods. The streams ran brighter now. Wildflowers began appearing cautiously among the moss. Birdsong returned in gentle pieces. And though both sisters sometimes found themselves glancing between the trees, hoping without meaning to, they walked onward all the same. For life, like spring itself, had begun moving quietly forward. And one morning, not far from the brook where they often wandered, the sisters came upon something very strange indeed. Spring came more fully into the woods with each passing day. The snow withdrew into the shaded hollows first, lingering beneath the dark fir trees and along the northern sides of stones, while the sunnier places softened into damp earth and new green. The brook that had murmured beneath the ice all winter now ran freely over the stones, bright and quick, carrying little pieces of leaf and twig along the way. The sisters walked often there. At first, they went quietly. Rose Red, who usually had a word for everything, sometimes paused beside the path and looked into the deeper forest as though half expecting to see a dark shape moving between the trees. Snow White noticed, because Snow White noticed most things. But she didn't speak of it at once. Some absences were gentler when left unnamed. Still, the woods were lovely in spring, and little by little, their hearts began to open with the season. Birds returned to the branches. Ferns uncurled beside the stream. Tiny flowers appeared in the moss, so small that Rose Red insisted one had to crouch low and look with respect in order to see them properly. One morning, when the air smelled of wet leaves and new grass, The sisters followed the brook farther than they had gone since winter. They had brought a basket for early herbs, though there were still more hopeful leaves than useful ones. Rose Red walked ahead, pushing aside the low branches with her hand, while Snow White followed more slowly, watching where the ground grew soft near the water. Then Rose Red stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Snow White listened. At first, she heard only a brook, the birds, and the soft stirring of the branches overhead. And then came another sound, a sharp, irritated little voice somewhere ahead in the trees. It wasn't calling for help. Exactly. It was scolding. Rose Red's eyebrows lifted. "That sounds like someone very angry with a tree," she said. They followed the voice along the brook until they came to a place where the old birch had split near the base. There, beside the trunk, stood the strangest little man either sister had ever seen. He was scarcely taller than a child, with a wrinkled face, bright dark eyes, and a long white beard that fell nearly to his knees. He wore a little pointed cap, a coat the color of bark, and boots so small and finely made that Rose Red stared at them for a moment before remembering her manners. The little man's beard had become caught fast in the split of the tree. He pulled and twisted and stamped his tiny feet, muttering furiously at all the while. "Wretched wood, miserable branch, treacherous forest," he snapped. "Never in all my years has a tree behaved so badly." Snow White stepped forward at once. "Are you hurt?" she asked. The little man spun toward her as far as his trapped beard would allow. "Hurt?" he cried. "Do I look as though I'm enjoying myself?" Rose Red pressed her lips together. Snow White gave her smallest warning glance. "We can help you," Snow White said gently. "I should hope so," the little man grumbled. "Don't stand there like two carved dolls. This beard is not ornamental shrubbery." The girls came closer and examined the place where the beard had caught. It had slipped deep into the crack of the birch, twisted round a splintered piece of wood, and tightened there so firmly that each tug only made the little man cry out louder. Rose Red tried first to loosen it with her fingers. The dwarf flinched. "Careful! Careful! You have no understanding of fine hair." "I'm trying," Rose Red said, with more patience than she felt. Snow White knelt beside the tree and worked quietly at the knot. She moved slowly, easing one strand and then another, but the beard had caught too deeply. At last she looked up. "I don't think we can free it without cutting a little." The dwarf's eyes widened. "Cut it!" he cried. "Cut my beard? My beautiful beard? My magnificent beard?" Rose Red glanced at the tangled white strands trapped in the birch. "It is either that," she said, "or stay here until the tree changes its mind." The little man glared at her. Snow White took the small scissors from her sewing pouch. She carried them often for gathering herbs, and now she opened them carefully. "I will cut only what I must," she promised. The dwarf groaned as though she had offered to cut down half of the forest. But when Snow White snipped the trapped end of the beard, the little man sprang free at once. He stumbled backward, clutched the short tip of his beard in both hands, and stared at it with horror. "My beard!" he cried. "My poor beard! You clumsy girls have ruined me." Rose Red blinked. "We freed you," she said. "You hacked at me like woodcutters," he snapped. Snow White rose slowly, folding the scissors back into her pouch. "I am sorry I had to cut it," she said, "but you were trapped." The dwarf did not appear to hear her. He snatched up a small sack hidden behind a tree, a sack neither sister had noticed before. It made a faint clicking sound as he dragged it into view. Rose Red looked at it curiously. "What's that?" The little man pulled the sack closer at once. "None of your business," he said sharply. "Greedy eyes everywhere I turn. First trees, now girls." "We don't want your sack," Snow White said. "I should hope not," the dwarf muttered. "It's mine." With that, he hoisted it over his shoulder, with surprising strength for someone so small and began hobbling away through the moss. After a few steps, he turned back. "And next time," he called, "keep your scissors to yourselves." Then he disappeared beyond the tangle of the young trees, still muttering about ruined beards, foolish girls, and the disgraceful habits of birches. For a moment, the sisters stood in silence. The brook hurried beside them as though nothing unusual had happened at all. At last, Rose Red let out a breath. "Well," she said, "the bear was certainly easier to help." Snow White looked toward the place where the little man had vanished. Then, despite herself, she smiled. He was more grateful, too. Rose Red laughed softly, though there was a little ache in it, too. They gathered their basket and turned back toward the path, leaving the split birch behind them. Yet, as they walked home through the brightening woods, Snow White found herself thinking of the little sack and the sound that it had made when the dwarf dragged it from behind the tree. A faint clicking, like coins, or stones, or something hidden. She didn't say so aloud. Not yet. The morning was too lovely for uneasiness, and Rose Red had already crouched beside the path to admire a cluster of small blue flowers opening bravely in the moss. So Snow White only paused beside her sister, and together they looked at the tiny blossoms while sunlight moved gently through the trees. Still, somewhere deeper in the forest, the strange little man was carrying his secret away. Spring settled more deeply into the forest as the days passed. The woods no longer felt half asleep as they had in early thaw. Ferns unfurled beside the brook. Moss grew brighter along fallen logs. Birds called from the branches overhead with such cheerfulness that even quiet mornings seemed somehow full. The sisters had returned to their old habit of wandering the woodland paths whenever the weather allowed. They gathered herbs where they found them, stopped to admire the wildflowers, and sometimes sat beside the brook simply to listen to the water moving over the stone. Yet now and then, though neither spoke of it often, both still found themselves glancing toward the deeper woods. The bear had been gone several weeks. Sometimes Rose Red thought she caught sight of a dark shape moving between the trees, only for it to vanish when she looked again. Snow White still listened on stormy evenings. Those storms grew fewer as spring warmed. The cottage remained warm, still lovely, still home. Yet there was, from time to time, a quiet feeling of someone missing. One morning, after a soft rain in the night, the sisters followed the brook farther downstream than usual. The air smelled of wet leaves and damp earth. Sunlight slipped through the trees in pale ribbons, and the water moved swiftly beside them, brighter now than it had been all winter. Rose Red had just begun explaining why she believed robins must surely think themselves far more important than other birds, when a sharp voice echoed through the trees. "Oh, leave off! Leave off this instant!" The sister stopped. A moment later came another sound, splashing, complaining, and what sounded very much like furious muttering. Rose Red looked at Snow White. "No," she said softly. Snow White's mouth twitched beside herself. "I believe so." They followed the sound around the bend, into the brook, and there, standing upon a smooth stone near the rushing water, was the little man. Or rather, hanging beside the rushing water. His long white beard had become tangled fast around the fishing line, and at the other end of it, some determined creature beneath the water tugged with astonishing force. The dwarf stumbled and flailed wildly. "My beard!" he shouted. "Not the beard of all disgraceful creatures!" A fish splashed hard beneath the water. The line jerked. The dwarf slipped dangerously near the edge. Without hesitation, Snow White hurried forward. "Careful!" she called. The little man turned and saw them. To their astonishment, he looked offended. "You again?" he snapped. "Must you appear everywhere?" Rose Red folded her arms. You seem to have an unusual talent for needing help. Another hard tug nearly pulled him into the stream. The dwarf yelped. Well, he cried, are you going to stand there and talk while I'm being carried off? The sisters hurried closer. Snow White tried to loosen the tangled line, but the beard had twisted tightly around it. Rose Red braced herself against the stone and grabbed hold of the dwarf's sleeve before the next strong pull sent him tumbling into the brook entirely. Honestly, Rose Red muttered, struggling to keep her footing, for someone so small, you're a remarkable amount of trouble. I heard that, the dwarf snapped. Snow White tried patiently to untangle the knot. The fish pulled again. The beard tightened. At last she sighed quietly. I'm afraid. The dwarf's eyes widened at once. No, he said quickly. No. You know exactly what I'm about to say, Snow White replied gently. My beard has only just recovered, he cried. Rose Red looked at the tangled mess and then at the rushing water. I think, she said reasonably, the fish has different plans. The dwarf groaned miserably, yet another hard pull nearly sent him headfirst into the stream. Oh, very well, he cried at last, but only the smallest bit. Very smallest. Snow White took out her scissors once more. Carefully, apologetically, she clipped only the trapped strands. At once, the dwarf stumbled free. The fishing line snapped loose. The unseen fish vanished downstream as though greatly pleased with itself. The little man staggered upright, clutching his shortened beard with both hands. My poor beard, he cried. It was drowning you, Rose Red pointed out. The dwarf ignored this entirely. Instead, he hurried toward a cluster of stones nearby and dragged out something hidden beneath them. This time, it wasn't a sack. It was a small chest. The sisters exchanged a glance. When the dwarf lifted the lid to inspect it anxiously, sunlight flashed suddenly across something bright inside. Gold. Perhaps jewels, too. It was difficult to tell. The dwarf snapped the lid shut at once. What are you staring at? He demanded. We weren't staring, Snow White said. You looked very interested, he muttered suspiciously. Rose Red blinked. You were nearly pulled into the river. Yes, and whose fault is that? He grumbled. The fish? Rose Red offered. The dwarf glared at her. Then, gathering his tiny chest tightly against himself, he gave an irritated sniff. If people would simply leave me alone, none of this would happen. Snow White looked at him quietly. You don't seem especially alone. The dwarf frowned as though this were somehow offensive too. With that, he gathered his things and marched off through the forest, muttering all the while about troublesome fish, meddling girls, and the terrible condition of modern forest. The sister stood beside the brook, listening to his voice grow fainter. At last, Rose Red let out a long breath. I am beginning to think, she said carefully, that he may simply enjoy being unhappy. Snow White laughed softly. Or perhaps, she said, he doesn't know what else to do. Rose Red glanced toward the deeper woods. The bear never behaved that way. No, Snow White said quietly. He never did. For a little while they stood listening to the brook. Sunlight moved softly over the water. Somewhere overhead birds sang among the branches, and though the woods had grown greener and brighter with spring, the sisters could not shake that feeling that the strange little man carried some trouble larger than his beard. Nor could Snow White forget the glimmer inside the tiny chest. Gold, jewels, secrets, something hidden, something guarded. The morning remained beautiful all the same. So at last the sisters gathered their basket once more and followed the path home through the flowering woods, though both found themselves wondering, if only quietly, whether this would truly be the last they saw of the strange little man. By late spring, the forest had changed once again. Leaves now moved softly overhead where the bare branches had once stood against the winter sky. Wildflowers brightened the woodland floor in pale blues and soft whites, and the brook, no longer restless with snowmelt, wandered gently through the woods as though content simply to sing to itself. The sisters still walked there often. Though spring had softened many things, neither had quite forgotten winter. Sometimes Rose Red still paused at the sound of movement among the trees, her heart lifting foolishly before she remembered. Sometimes Snow White, on stormy evenings, still found herself listening for a familiar knock upon the cottage door. The cottage remained warm, still lovely, still home. Yet now and then it felt as though someone quiet and steady had stepped away from the fire and not yet returned. One bright morning, the sisters wandered farther into the woods than usual, gathering herbs and blossoms where sunlight lingered longest beneath the trees. Rose Red had just begun to gather a handful of flowering thyme growing between warm stones when there came a voice, sharp, cross, very familiar. "Mind where you step. Must everything in this forest seek to trouble me?" Rose Red slowly looked up. Snow White lifted her eyes from the brook nearby. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, "No," Rose Red said softly. Snow White smiled despite herself. "I believe so." Following the sound through the trees, they soon came upon a small clearing warmed by sunlight. And there, to neither sister's surprise, stood the little dwarf, or rather, hurried anxiously back and forth. Before him lay several heaps of glittering treasure spread carefully upon the moss. Coins flashed brightly in the morning light, jewels gleamed in little piles, chains of gold and silver rested upon a cloth spread neatly over the roots of an old tree. The dwarf moved nervously among them, counting and rearranging. "This one here," he muttered. "No, there. Too bright, too obvious." Every few moments he glanced anxiously into the forest. He had not yet noticed the sisters. Rose Red folded her arms. "He appears no happier surrounded by treasure," she whispered. "No," Snow White said softly, "only more worried." At that moment, the sudden shadow swept overhead. The dwarf gave a cry. Before either sister fully understood what had happened, a great bird swooped sharply downward through the clearing, its talons catching in the dwarf's coat and beard. The little man shrieked. "Not again!" The bird struggled upward, dragging him awkwardly over the ground. Without hesitation, the sisters rushed forward. Snow White caught hold of the dwarf's coat, while Rose Red freed the tangled beard from the root that it had caught fast against. The startled bird gave one angry flap of its wings, and at last released him, soaring back into the trees. The dwarf tumbled into the moss. "My coat!" he cried immediately. "Look at my coat!" Rose Red blinked. "You were nearly carried away." "And who asked you for interference?" he snapped. Snow White gently brushed the leaves from his sleeve. "We only wished to help." "Well, help less," he muttered bitterly. The sisters exchanged a glance. Neither seemed especially surprised any more. At last, the dwarf scrambled toward his treasure, gathering coins anxiously into little piles. Then, the forest grew still. A branch shifted softly somewhere beyond the clearing. The birds fell suddenly quiet, and from the shadows, between the trees, the bear stepped forward. He moved without hurry, without sound. Dark fur gleamed beneath the filtered spring light. For one suspended moment, the whole clearing seemed to pause. Rose Red drew in a deep breath. Snow White felt warmth rush unexpectedly through her chest. The bear. He had returned, and though the spring woods surrounded him now instead of snow, he was unmistakably the same. The dwarf saw him at once. All color drained from his face. "Oh no," he gasped. At once, he rushed forward and threw himself upon the ground before the bear. "Dear bear," he cried desperately, "spare me, spare my poor life." Then pointing wildly toward the sisters, he added, "Take these two girls instead. Young and tender flesh is surely better than nasty old fellows such as me." For one startled heartbeat, even the wind seemed to grow still. Rose Red stared at him. Snow White could scarcely believe what she had heard. After everything, after every kindness, this little man would hand them over without a second thought. The bear said nothing. Not a word. He simply looked once toward the sisters, and in that quiet moment, neither felt afraid. Not even a little. Because somehow, they knew, whatever happened next, he would not let harm come to them. The dwarf backed frantically away from his treasure. "Take the gold," he cried. "Take the jewels. Take anything." Still, the bear said nothing. He moved swiftly. The struggle ended almost before it began. And when it was over, the forest settled quietly once again. Birdsong returned overhead. Leaves stirred softly in the breeze. The strange little man, who had carried so much bitterness through the woods, troubled no one any more. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, something wondrous began to happen. The great dark shape of the bear shimmered faintly in the morning light. The sisters stood perfectly still. The fur seemed to fall away like shadow lifting from water. And where the bear had stood, there now stood a young man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in garments finer than any the sisters had ever seen, though worn by hardship and time. Yet what startled them most was not the richness of his clothing, nor even the wonder of what had happened. It was his eyes, kind, steady, quietly familiar. Rose Red pressed her hand to her chest. Snow White felt suddenly as though winter had stepped softly back into the clearing. "The bear," Rose whispered. The young man smiled gently. "Yes," he said softly. "The bear." Then he told him his story. He was a prince, he explained, and the wicked dwarf had long ago stolen his treasure and bound him beneath an enchantment, forcing him to live as a bear until the dwarf's power had finally ended. Only during winter had he safely walked near others, hidden beneath snow and darkness. Only then had he found shelter and kindness. As he spoke, the sisters listened quietly, yet even while wonder filled the moment, neither could stop looking for traces of the bear they had known. Snow White noticed the gentleness in his voice. Rose Red recognized the quiet steadiness in the way he stood. And suddenly, though the shape before them had changed, something inside them softened, because they understood. They had not truly lost the bear. He had come back to them after all. And somehow, he no longer looked lonely. For a little while after the prince had finished his story, the sisters simply stood in the quiet clearing, listening. Sunlight moved softly through the leaves overhead. The brook wandered gently nearby. And though spring birds still sang in the branches, everything somehow felt changed. Not in a frightening way, only in the strange, quiet way that the world sometimes changes after wonder has stepped suddenly into ordinary life. Rose Red looked at him first, not at the fine clothes, not at the prince he claimed to be, only at his eyes, still steady, still kind, still carrying that same quiet warmth she remembered beside the fire. Snow White noticed it too, and though the shape before them had changed, something deep inside her settled. The bear had not disappeared after all. He had simply been waiting to be found again. At length, Rose Red smiled. "You truly came back," she said softly. The prince's expression gentled. "I told myself I would," he said, "though I didn't know what shape I might return in." Snow White laughed quietly at this. "I think," she said, "we liked the first shape very well." At this, something warm crossed the prince's face, something lighter than sorrow. "I hoped," he admitted softly, "that perhaps you had not forgotten me." Rose Red gave a small sound of disbelief. "Forgotten? You slept beside our hearth for an entire winter." "And cleared snow better than any broom," Snow White added. The prince laughed then, low and surprised. as though laughter had not visited him very often. And somehow, hearing it beneath the spring trees, both sisters felt the last quiet ache of winter softened. The prince gathered the treasure that had long been stolen from him and explained that a castle stood not far beyond the forest, though he had not returned there since the enchantment first fell upon him. "My brother remained there," he said quietly. "He kept faith that one day I would return." The sisters listened closely. Though the morning had already become far stranger than either could have expected, neither wished to leave the story unfinished. So together, they walked back through the forest, the prince beside them. Sunlight moved softly through the leaves overhead. Rose Red talked more than usual, as though making up for all the months the bear had spent speaking so little. Snow White walked quietly beside them, listening. And every so often, she caught herself smiling, because though the prince's steps sounded different than the paws upon the woodland earth, somehow he still felt familiar. When at last they reached the cottage, their mother stood near the garden gathering herbs beside the rose trees. She looked up. For one startled moment, surprise crossed her face at the sight of the stranger walking beside her daughters. Then her gaze rested upon him more carefully. Something quiet passed across her expression. Recognition. Not of appearance, but of presence. "You have returned," she said softly. The prince bowed his head. "Yes," he answered. "And this time," Rose Red said quickly, unable to help herself, "he's arrived without snow in his fur." The mother laughed quietly then. "Well," she said, "he is welcome all the same." So the prince entered the cottage once more. Only now, spring light rested warmly upon the floor where the winter firelight had once. And though the shape beside the hearth had changed, something about the room felt quietly right again. He visited often after that, at first for long afternoons, then evenings, and before long whole days passed in easy companionship. Sometimes he walked with the sisters through the woods that they had once shown him in the winter. Snow White showed him where the violets first appeared beneath the trees and where the brook sounded gentlest near dusk. Rose Red insisted he admire every flower she declared unusually brave and every fox trail she considered especially interesting. And in the evenings, when supper was finished and the fire burned softly low, he sat once again near the hearth where their mother mended clothes and stories settled gently around the room. Only now there was laughter too, and hope. The prince's brother came at last, before summer fully arrived. He had searched for many years and scarcely believed what he saw when at last the brothers stood together again. The joy between them filled even the little cottage, and before long, as fairy tales often do, the story turned gently toward happiness. The prince, who had once wandered lonely through the winter woods and rested beside their hearth through long snowy evenings, came to love Snow White most dearly. Perhaps had begun during the quiet winter nights when she sat beside the fire speaking softly into the silence, never asking him to explain more than he wished to give. Or perhaps kindness simply remembers kindness. Whatever the reason, in time, he asked Snow White to marry him, and Snow White, whose heart had quietly known him long before the enchantment ever lifted, gladly said yes. The prince's brother, warm-hearted and thoughtful in ways that suited Rose Red's brightness, soon grew equally fond of her cheerful spirit. And before long, Rose Red married him too. Their mother came to live near them, where she was never lonely again. The 2 rose trees were carefully brought and planted outside their new home. One bloomed white, the other red. And every spring the sisters watched them flower side by side. And whenever winter came again, when snow gathered softly outside, the firelight glowed warmly through the windows, they sometimes remembered the season when the quiet bear had knocked upon the cottage door, carrying cold upon his fur, and left behind something far warmer than anyone could have expected. For kindness, given freely, has a curious way of returning to us. sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly, and sometimes wearing an entirely different shape than when it first arrived. And so, Snow White and Rose Red lived long and happily, with warmth beside them, family near, and the memory of one very unusual winter resting gently among the sweetest stories of their lives. There are seasons in life that feel colder than others. Quiet seasons, lonely seasons, the kind where the days feel long and the nights stretch quietly onward, and we wonder if warmth will ever fully return. And yet, sometimes comfort arrives in ways we never could have expected. Not always in grand moments, not always in the shape we imagined. Sometimes it comes quietly. In a fire kept warm for someone weary, a place made at the table, a kindness offered without asking what might come in return, or the steady comfort of simply being welcomed as we are. Tonight's story reminds us that kindness has a way of changing things. A warm hearth, a patient heart, the courage to care for someone before fully understanding who they are. And perhaps, wherever you are tonight, there are quiet kindnesses surrounding you too. Some already resting softly beside you, and some still finding their way through the woods toward your door. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening with me. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You have been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.